Welcome everybody to Ii Biennial 2022 presents Oulu2026 In the Air. When we were gathering the compilation of artworks with the curators, we had this line hanging in the air. It went like this: in the air, felt by a number of people to be happening or about to happen. And somehow this, as well as it summarizes the theme of our Ii Biennial this year, it also summarizes the situation that we are in the Oulu area now. So we have this huge cultural capital potential coming up in the coming years. So welcome. We have arranged this event in cooperation with the Oulu2026 organization. And in this event, we will highlight the art and science collaborations of the biennial and also in general. So is this the future of art making? First, we will enjoy a performative lecture by Hanna Husbergin and Agata Marzecovan, the invited artists of Ii Biennial. A is for Aurora, C is for Care. Towards Atmospheric Care is a long-term research collaboration between Stockholm-based visual artist Hanna Husbergin and Tallinn-based researcher in ecology, photography and new media Agata Marzecovan, which this project explores air as a natural cultural phenomenon situated in the nexus of media, science and technological mediation. Bringing theory, criticism and scientific research together with feminist methodologies, art and poetics. Towards Atmospheric Care examines the overlapping boundaries between the aesthetic, science and politics of air and atmosphere, highlighting the atmospheric sensibilities, highlighting that atmospheric sensibilities are not naturally granted, but emerge through non-neutral scientific, managerial and cultural practices that interweave different bodies, technologies and socio-technical imaginaries. The project hopes to cultivate atmospheric care as a broadly interdisciplinary, political and collective concern. Welcome, Hanna and Agata.
Most people visualize the Earth as a small planet in the endless black void of empty space. In reality, we are surrounded by a dynamically changing region of charged electrical particles and magnetic and electric fields.
How do we depict something? Not only in artistic context, but also in more scientific, more enlightening context. How do we agree on what is aurora and what is not? In the 17th century, there was what we call the Maunder minimum, a long period of low solar activity, during which the auroras were so scarce they almost became a myth. And in 1707, aurora suddenly returned, with great spectacles of aurora taking place as far south as France and Italy. That made quite a fuss. In 1716, another big aurora occurred. At those latitudes, no one had really seen aurora before. This was just at the beginning of the Enlightenment, so of course people were asking, what is this?
In the ionosphere, you often get irregularities. They occur naturally with the aurora. We call it space weather. These irregularities affect radio, communication, and navigation systems, especially at the higher latitudes. When you have strong events, solar storms, it affects the electric currents. In extreme cases, you can get blackouts and transformers can burn down. These events are rare, but they can happen. It happened in Quebec some years ago. They had a major blackout.
As Victoria Barabash, senior lecturer in space technology, told us, space is much closer than we think. As we're increasingly dependent on technology, we are also more vulnerable to its influence. Everything becomes global, and it's all connected to geospace. Even if you're a manager of an industrial company, it would be good to have some ideas of what is going on in the near space. You cannot just say this is the atmosphere and this is outer space. No, they work together closely.
So Earth is the magnet. It has a magnetic field shielding it from solar winds and particles. Magnetic fields cannot mix. It's like a string of pearls. Each pearl is a blob of plasma, and the string is the field line. When you get substantial variations in the magnetosphere, you get aurora. Why aurora there? Simply because of the structure of the magnetosphere.
In Under the Rays of the Aurora Borealis from 1885, Danish explorer Sophus Stromholdt proposes an illustration of two observers looking at the aurora. Observed from different perspectives, the aurora takes on varying shapes and at times even contrasting colors. While the image focuses on geographical positions, observation points have always been more diverse. There have been many observers of auroral phenomena, both known and unknown, who, depending on their own positions and contingent on their cultural, historical, and sociopolitical context, have contributed to a multiplicity of different perspectives and conceptualizations of auroras as variably magical, biblical, scientific, economic, political, and aesthetic phenomena. Under the Rays of the Aurora Borealis is situated in Sápmi. While the principal cause of Stromholdt's journey was to study auroral phenomena, the book is framed as a traveling account of his year-long sojourn in the land of the Lapps and the Khans, which is also the subtitle of his book. The life, people, and nature of Arctic Fennoscandia are portrayed together with Stromholdt's auroral research. Auroral observations are consistently part of the everyday lives of the local inhabitants. However, the book does not reveal any observations or perspectives of Sami people on the phenomena.
Stromholdt's observers seems to gaze towards the aurora directly. Their view is unobstructed by technical devices. Still, the author lists the many tasks and the regularity of the scientists on duty, including the handling of instruments with hands benumbed with cold. Anemometer, barometer, telescopes, thermometer, auroral theodolite, spectroscopes, astronomical charts, photographic apparatus, lighted disk for writing. Since the 19th century, much of what we know about the transient and constantly changing aurora has been observed and sensed through imaging technologies and instruments, considerably affecting and altering understanding of the phenomena. While auroras occur in specific regions, it is not the position alone that matters, but also the tools of the observer that render the specific appearances of aurora possible. Today, multiple instruments in the air, on satellite, and on the ground, including radars, cameras, rockets, navigation satellite receivers, and other radio instruments, observe and measure auroral and near-space processes. They produce large datasets that need to be analyzed computationally. In this process, observation becomes a big data thing, in which the observer is not necessarily a human figure.
Spectrum comes from Latin, meaning image or apparition, and was introduced into optics in the 17th century, referring to the spread of colors observed as white sunlight disperses through a prism. As infrared and ultraviolet radiation were discovered in the 19th century, visible light started to be understood as part of a much broader electromagnetic spectrum, opening up for the detection of new portions of invisible frequencies, notably radio waves, microwaves, gamma rays, and X-rays. Unlike the science of colors driven by romantic curiosity and enlightenment, much of what we know about what we call the airwaves, the radio frequencies, or the electromagnetic spectrum, as well as the spaces of propagation, such as the ionosphere, is achieved through the entanglements of science, militarization, and commercialization. Starting with the transatlantic wireless radio, the electromagnetic spectrum has become the medium of the information age and the conduit of global communication and economy. This has positioned Earth's electromagnetosphere, a life support system central for the maintenance of life as we know it, as an invisible resource to be managed and regulated, colonized and exploited, initially for military purposes, state control and policing, and increasingly for commercial profit. As a result, most of the airwaves useful for telecommunications are exclusively licensed, legally supervised, and their use is highly sanctioned.
Looking at historical processes of the neoliberal enclosure of electromagnetic domain, historian Edward D. Melillo highlights the double invisibility. Aggressive regimes of privatization and exploitation are as invisible as the electromagnetosphere itself, treating the process of making visible as a dual task of rendering electromagnetic phenomena, as well as the processes of their exploitation visible and knowable, is critical, because it provides the opportunity to recast the electromagnetic commons as a space for fostering freedoms other than exploitative agency. Different from other resources, the principal use of spectrum is in the act of sharing information between transmitter and receiver. Looking beyond the military and neoliberal exploitation of electromagnetic fields that have sought to violently transform the spectrum into a hierarchical, homogenized space of control for the realization of the technocratic mantra, stabilize, privatize, and liberalize, we may instead revisit Vandana Shiva's reading of the early modern concept of resource as a notion comprising respect, responsibility, reciprocity, and care.
auroras are amongst the only perceptible phenomena that make visible the materiality of the upper atmosphere and reveal the existence of Sun-Earth interactions, as well as a planetary ecology and electromagnetic sphere that stretches much further than the projection of the blue marble. How we perceive and represent this expanded, radiating ecology and our position as humans within it is entwined with the techno-ecological, political and material circumstances that have made geospace and its atmospheric phenomena knowable. It is connected with the militarization and commercialization of telecommunication and space technology, and the historical reliance on expert science performed by a very small group of people using very specific instruments, while other kinds of knowledge are mostly ignored.
In this context, asking how to care for the imperceptible environment and how to meaningfully consider an ecology that, while difficult to comprehend, is entangled with space and communication technologies and environmental processes which condition and structure our everyday life, raises question on the epistemology of care.
In the words of Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, generating care means counting in participants and issues who have not managed or are not likely to succeed in articulating their concerns, or whose modes of articulation indicate a politics that is imperceptible within prevalent ways of understanding. In other words, whose and which concerns matter, and how are they represented? Who is the observer? What are his instruments? Who takes care of them and of their becoming in an increasingly post-human and datafied world?
Caring and relating share conceptual and ontological resonance. To care about something or for somebody is inevitably to create a relation and therefore to be affected. Caring requires engaging with the asymmetrical relationalities and inescapable troubles of interdependent existences. Therefore, caring or daring to care is always risky and non-innocent. It is a doing embedded in a populated world, characterized by its insiderness or wittiness. What happens if you dare to open the black box?
Thank you, Hanna and Agata, for this performative lecture. I think it opened nicely this discussion that we're going to have on air and the sense of change in the air. My name is Jetta Huttunen. I'm the executive manager of Art Center Kulttuurikauppilan, and I will be the moderator of this discussion. And I will let you introduce yourselves. So let's start there with Agata and move to Mark through the row. A short introduction.
So we introduce our work right now? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, so I'm Agata Marzecovan from Tovar's Atmospheric Care Project.
And I'm Hanna, and Jetta already introduced towards atmospheric care, but we wanted to maybe emphasize that we really work through situated case studies because of the vastness of air and atmospheric issues. So we've been working on Beijing smog, which is connected to the installation in one of the barns, and now on Aurora as this manifestation of Earth-Sun interactions and other case studies. And for us, an important question, which is always in the back of our minds, is how can we care for what is inaccessible to direct experience, yet in far-reaching ways structures both our daily lives and our future? So, so basically, air does this, and air and atmosphere in extension in a lot of different ways, and also with this project that we just presented, there's also these technological dimensions of how we know and can access the invisibility of air and atmosphere. And something which has come forth very strongly through our case studies is that you cannot approach air and atmosphere through one perspective, but you need a lot of different. You need a multiplicity of ways of looking at it to actually understand it. So this is also what has brought us to a transdisciplinary approach, and also brought up the importance of imaginaries and the role of science in creating those imaginaries.
Yes, so what is very interesting about atmosphere, it's invisibility. But of course, we can perceive air and atmosphere, or we do. And actually, in this Biennale, there are things on breathing and different ways of touching the air. However, there is also a lot of aspects which extend beyond our senses, and they influence our society. So, we try to start from this thing which we can approach, but also see how it extends farther. So Aurora is something, we were not like Aurora enthusiasts, but we had the opportunity to go to the north, and we were thinking about atmospheric phenomena, what is happening here, and you have a lot of other interesting phenomena, but this Aurora is something very visible. And but when you start talking, we interviewed we had the chance to visit through fieldwork different contexts, and we find out that it is very important nowadays, the science language, also when we describe this upper atmosphere, and we also found this extension that you start looking at Aurora, but nowadays people studying Aurora, they have a huge infrastructures, and they bring these things like ionosphere, geospace, and these are things which are invisible or we can't touch them, and this brings up the idea of imagination and imaginaries. How do we construct our understanding of how these things work? And we also realize that these imaginations have a material impact because they influence how we act upon the world, and so how we structure our imagination matters. And that's what we call like studying imaginaries, how people imagine things. And in atmosphere nowadays, science is a very important, even though there are many different ways of knowing, science is very important, or dominant, I would say. And while we don't question the science in terms of relativizing it, we actually are, I'm also trained as a scientist, so it's something I'm very enthusiastic about. But also we are thinking about how to connect to this black box of science, or these are very complicated and complex topics, and when we interview experts, it's really hard, like we need to find a language how to communicate between each other, and it takes time and effort from both sides. So so we are very interested in how to find these languages between disciplines and ways of knowing, and maybe that's what I wanted to say.
Okay, you plunged straight into the discussion. Well, it's okay. That's perfectly. That's what we want to do. So maybe also Minna and Mark can.
Yeah, that's why we are here.
Plunge into the discussion straight away. So, what kind of thoughts do these thoughts of Hanna and Agata give you? You can also introduce yourself.
Yeah, I think I introduce myself first and tell a little bit what kind of work we do.
Yes, exactly.
So I'm Minna Rainio, and I'm one of the curators of this Biennale, and I'm also an artist and researcher, and I have a doctorate in arts also. And I work together with Mark, and we create large-scale installations and short films. And our topics have ranged from, for a long time we were working on themes around migration and borders and refugees. And then for the last more than 5 years, even 7, well, anyway, many years we've been working more on issues related to climate change. One installation was relating to the effect of climate change into the oceans and the oceans ecosystems. We've done work about endangered birds. The most recent film, To Teach a Bird to Fly, was about a project that aims to rewild a northern bald ibis. And our works are kind of research-based, so we often start with quite a long process of extensive research. We read a lot, and then it's very wide. You know, the topics in the beginning are very wide, and then they start to kind of focus and narrow down as we work during the process. But you can maybe continue, so I don't say everything.
I mean, you said what we do largely. Yeah. Well, I'm Mark Roberts. I'm also one of the curators, and as Minna said, I work with her on our films and installations. I mean, I'll just carry on by saying, like, you know, for example, I think one of the major works we did about the ocean drew heavily on the IPCC report, which we actually exhibited as part of the exhibition as well. So it's this 1,000-page document compiled by hundreds of scientists into the state of the oceans, and we kind of used that to create the narrative of the work. So I would say that increasingly we use science as a major research source for the work that we do.
And I could maybe pick up on something you were talking about the invisibility and the invisibility of air. And since we got interested or sort of started to deal with the issues related to climate crisis, climate change in the oceans, for example. And I think one thing that kind of drove us, or it sort of was a challenge for us, is that it's very difficult to represent or depict climate change in visual arts, because it's largely something that you can't really see. It's something that is happening. It's kind of slow. It's this kind of slow violence towards the planet and the earth and all the species here. But things that are happening now, the consequences or the result of the actions today are visible maybe only in 30 years. So like kind of what we see is happening now, it's a result of something that happened maybe 20 years ago. So there's so many, like it's kind of, it's very, in a way it's very difficult, but that makes it also kind of quite interesting. And also there's a lot of talk about how we need interdisciplinary collaboration between artists and scientists, and how we need arts, how we need stories to make this planetary crisis somehow more understandable for people also in an emotional level. And that's where art can come to this, and this kind of collaboration between art and science is that with arts we add the imagination and we can add the emotions and the affects, and then it can somehow maybe become more, or bring the issue closer to people than pure scientific texts. And also people have a lot of anxiety and a lot of sorrow and a lot of fear about what is happening at the moment to our planet, if we're now talking about climate change. And art can be one way to sort of also deal with these emotions or encounter them. So that's like also something that we've been trying to do with our work.
Yeah, yeah. How do you, I would like to maybe throw the ball back to Hanna and Agata, because also we have Hanna's work in the art barns. You can maybe pronounce the name of the artwork. I still haven't learned to say how it goes. So how are, often people ask how the birds are affected by air.
Yes.
Hey.
I got it right. So, because we now have an audience that has seen it, and everybody loves it. And there's a story there also. So and it's imaginaries, as you said. So do you think this is the thing that art science collaboration will do that. The science which has no stories needs art to make its information more acceptable, or a way to take in the information of science.
I think science probably has lots of stories, but the question is what kind of stories, and maybe we need to get away from these heroic kind of stories and see also the practicalities of how science is made as a practice. And this is also something that we encountered very much in the Aurora project, because we visited these research facilities for studying the ionosphere, which are in this moment actually being remade in a way where scientists will practically not be present. There will be very few actual people on site. The data will be connected using antennas, which will then be available at distance, and it becomes much more of an engineering perspective. Like you need to actually know the knowledge of how you do science is shifting very much, and the embodied knowledge that scientists have had for hundreds of years, and which maybe hasn't been the story that we have been telling so much, but which is actually an important part of how science and our understandings of the world have been constructed. So I think it's maybe not that science doesn't have stories, but that there are many different voices and stories that can be told, and that maybe as an artistic methods can be used for conveying these kinds of stories, which can be the stories of all kinds of Beijingers, which just have this very everyday connection to the air that they are breathing, which maybe also comes from living there for decades or for a longer time. So there's so many narrations to be told, and then there's a lot of work of which, like, as we ask, who is the observer, and what perspectives are being brought forth. So I think we are maybe in a process of complexifying, which is maybe not simplifying things, but something that might be needed.
Maybe I can also add that we should kind of cultivate understanding of art of having many, I don't want to say like functions and more, so it doesn't have to be always functional, no, but what is also interesting to look at the kind of equality or equity between art and science and other forms of knowledge production, and as an example, and there are different ways what we are like expanding the idea of knowledge, or so not only what is like art can bring these things which are not quantifiable into a fold of knowledge or even evidence sometimes. So sometimes you don't have to have a number to know that something is like harming people and environment. So there is also this extension. But also, for example, you can produce kind of academic or important knowledge of understanding of phenomena through art. And as an example, with Hanna's material from Beijing, we turn it, besides artistic outcomes, we also found a way to make it into a book in an academic publication, and also academic paper in human geography context, something called Environmental Planning, Politics and Space. And then the artistic materials is a source of knowledge about kind of extending or maybe complexifying idea what is pollution, because the science focuses on the quantification and the number, but I think we try to combine the scientific and the extended perspective, and utilizing the interviews with people from Hanna's research. So it also became art informing the academic or scientific, if we...
Yes.
So, and that it's the equality of these two domains, which is also interesting.
I will a little bit go back to the stories because Minna and Mark, you are essentially storytellers. Filmmakers are storytellers. And in a way, when we were compiling this Biennale's compilation of artworks, we were also looking for some kind of a common story to tell about our theme. And I felt that we were touched by the proposals that had a story somewhere, a story then kind of this, what you call this hissipuhe, that you can also give us clear synopsis of an artwork, and it opens up to anybody who listens it, and they get a sense of emotion, the emotion of a story. So is this something, I'm asking this again, is this something, this story, something that art wants to give people? And maybe just add the fact that also you make all your artworks with a lot of research. So what is the kind of the win-win situation here with combining the story and the research?
Well, I think from our perspective, when we create an artwork, we set out with a goal of making that artwork as, not when we say accessible to as many people as possible. I don't mean to dumb it down by saying that, but we want to kind of like, if we're dealing with something which is scientific and difficult and we want to communicate these ideas to people, we want to kind of make it in such a way that as many people as possible can get something out of it. So, I mean, in that sense, we kind of use narrative as a means of communicating that. But I mean, I totally agree with what Hanna was saying about, like, one of the things we've been doing more and more is embracing the complicatedness of things. So it's not a matter of reducing things to something simple. It's saying, okay, there are so many things going on, you can't possibly tell one story. There's hundreds of elements, hundreds of viewpoints which kind of contribute to what you're trying to say. And I think one of the things about this Biennale, which this does, is, yes, these pieces which we've selected tell stories of their own, but together they do something else as a whole. They each contribute their voice to something more than their individual parts. And I think that's what we also try to do in our own work.
And I think with our works, I think what I love about making art, in making art in comparison just working as a pure researcher, which I've also have done and do, is that in a way, like, I can get very inspired about scientific research and research in general. I can read that and it gives me ideas. But then when I do, or we write or make a script and make an artwork, I can, in a way, shake a certain kind of approach which comes with the scientific or world or academia. And I can kind of creatively be more creative and free in using the knowledge that I have gained and the inspiration that I have got from these research texts. And then what we do with our works often with Mark is that we also combine these fictional elements so we do this so-called documentary fiction, films and installations in which we combine different elements, or we often have parallel narratives. And I think this comes back to what Mark was just saying also about this, which kind of brings in the complicatedness, that everything is complicated and we're not even trying to give an answer, one story or one narrative, but we combine these different elements. We often have parallel temporal narratives also that viewers have to kind of figure out what's going on and kind of combine these different elements. I don't know if you want to say more about the documentary fiction.
No, not really. I mean, it's just, I mean, we use these multi-layered narratives to bring something else out, really. That's the main point.
And this is, again, something that you can do in the arts, and which you couldn't very easily do in a peer-reviewed scientific paper, which I'm not criticizing that world either. It's, of course, it has its place and importance, but for me, in a way, existing, I have like a foot in both worlds in a way, and then in the artistic freedom is something quite interesting that you can.
Yes, yes, and of course we also chose for the biennial works that do artistic and technology/academic collaboration. That was one of the things that we focused on when we were gathering the compilation, and also what was something in your work that we wanted to have you here to have this side of scientific/academic/artistic approach. But we were earlier, I think it was Agata saying, talking about knowledge production, and knowledge production is something that kind of, we have different entities in our societies producing knowledge. And your stance in producing knowledge is one, my stance producing knowledge is something. So how do you think that these kind of different discourses of knowledge production in our societies, if we look outside of the scientific and art world, how do these knowledge production discourses meet each other, and what happens when they meet each other?
There's a question.
Yeah, I don't know, it's a difficult one, but for example, with Minna and Mark, we have been discussing this issue that if you are talking to an art/science audience, you have a specific audience which is already on your side. But if you are talking to another audience, which is a wider audience, then you might have a Trump supporter that has absolutely no idea what you're talking about, is not grabbing your story or anything. So how do we, because of course I am on your side and I totally understand the stories you're telling, the knowledge production you are representing here. But we also have to take into consideration, and not everybody is maybe understanding.
I don't know. I don't think as an artist, even if I work with this type of themes which are ecological or political or whatever, but I don't think I'm aim to convert anyone. So I'm not like, I think that's a different thing. Then that's more like a communication. So something when you're kind of trying to really convert a Trump supporter, if we want to use that example, into believing in climate change or something like that.
Yes.
So in a way, I don't think. I think if you start thinking like that as an artist, it can also be quite paralyzing, because you can't like influence all the audiences somehow. Like the audience is what it is. Sometimes it's more broad, sometimes it's more narrow. But it's something that, like, I know there's often like that. Okay, you're preaching to the converted, and it's like, what's the point? Because people who see these works are already thinking this and so on. But yeah, I don't know.
But there was a good slide in the presentation which we just saw, which was about the different perspectives of viewing the aurora. So you might see one thing from one perspective, and if you're standing somewhere else, you might see a completely different view. Now, isn't that also true of any knowledge production? Because, I mean, even with science, we take, well, we would like to believe that science is a form of truth, perhaps, but it's not always that way, is it? I mean, science is used to argue against the effects of climate change by a minority of scientists who are dragged out to support fake statistics.
Yep.
But it's still presented as science. And knowledge is always, there's always, an oppositional viewpoint and a different perspective which can be kind of presented as an argument against that. And we've come to see that as a negative thing with the idea of alternative facts and things like that. But in truth, there's always been disagreement and discussion and discourse. It's now just unfortunate that the kind of needle has swung to the negative side rather than the more balanced discourse. So I think from the artistic side, you have things like unreliable narration in films and literature. So you're not always presenting the actual truth. You're using different viewpoints to tell a different story. And I think that can be certainly true from a scientific perspective as well. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I think what can be also added to this equation is the time and multiplicity, in a sense that trying to answer everything in one artwork can, like, if you have already a problem formulated, you can maybe address it with more activist art. But sometimes you need to also kind of cultivate a different understanding, which takes time and experience. So you can take it, for example, that our work does something and there are many other people working in this kind of ecologizing our societal sensibility. So we want to think more ecologically and also socially, and maybe this having many artworks like that can help to kind of shift the tide. So not one, but many. And the time comes also for this finding a language and finding the experience. So I think having a chance to repeat and kind of find your way is, I think it's also like broadly, we need time to shift this or cultivate this ecological sensibility, but also like we learned something doing something. So we had the opportunity to study aurora, and we learned it, like dealing with this phenomena gave us insight we didn't know we didn't have even, and this helps us to do other work. Now we want to, and it brought us to realize the importance of the electromagnetic aspects of the air and atmosphere, and we would like to more, for example, how the communication is carried through air and study that. And maybe this topic is more broadly interested to other people, but we also started with this. Maybe some people found this aurora like a niche problem because this is not like a climate change. Climate change is very urgent, and aurora is something which is nice, but it doesn't affect us. But actually, when we've studied it, then we learned that these ionospheric processes can shut out our whole communication systems also, but we just don't think about it. So having this opportunity to work with things is also important, and partially, so you maybe don't answer with the first work, but maybe you get somewhere, hopefully, in time.
Yes, yes, yes.
And I think this kind of thing is like you don't maybe see the change, you don't see it, what the meaning of, let's say, different artworks and is when it's happening, but you kind of see it in retrospect. You can see that, or you can already see it now, in fact, that there is so much artworks being made around, let's say, human-animal relation and all these kind of topics which weren't there maybe 30 years ago so much. And then in 20 years we can see, and okay, there was this shift, and all these different small projects around the world or around different places kind of came together, and something might have shifted.
Yes.
More largely as well, some perspective and things or whatever.
So you are, as artists / researchers, creating change in your works.
Hypothetically.
Let's hope that also concretely. Well, it's time to sum up. If in fact you've been talking about this, I don't know, say. Well, you can also. Well, let's say so that what I get from this conversation is that. Okay, we have a way of looking at the world, things. We get interested. We have a artistic or scientific imagination that we start using, and then we create art. And this art emotionally touches, hopefully, our audience. And there is the change. Somehow this is very hopeful. We are looking into the future where we hope there is more imagination from everybody's side, also the audience's side. So out of these niches and more into vast stories. Am I making any sense?
Very much, and I think that's definitely what we try to point at is imaginaries are really a collective concern. So it is not the singular projects, but it is the meetings between people, the audience, the work, and these kinds of situations that really generate a potential shift in imaginaries.
Yeah, and also there is maybe beyond this duality, science and art, and maybe it's more not about making art more important, but also create space for the multiplicity. So
yes.
with the air experience, it's often the people who live. We always live in the environment, and maybe it's also a place for making the stories of the everyday experience matter and finding place how to consider it, whether it is the climate change, pollution, or even like the aurora is something which is in everyday life of many people, but we just don't hear these stories. We just see the pictures of tourists. So this kind of making the everyday experience from different situated context part of our collective narrative.
And I would also continue from the imagination is that if we are living this age of big planetary change and we don't know what the future will be like. So I think this is also this like you were talking about, this kind of collective imagination or imaginaries, that the kind of perspectives of views to or imagination to the future we are being given at the moment, mostly, especially in popular culture, are quite dystopic. And I think one thing to do here is also to try to imagine the change and imagine what would be the future that we want to go towards. And it's easier to go towards something that we have imagined. So we have to be able to imagine also better futures, something to aim towards. And I think also art can have a role in that. And also what we try to do in our most recent film is that.
Yeah. Well, I think that sums it up pretty nicely. Thank you, panelists, and thank you, audience.
You have questions?
And you can ask.
It's been a long time since I thought about Bertolt Brecht, to be honest, but
Okay, we've been asked about what we think about Bertolt Brecht in this context and also Galileo, but actually I would grab the point there that this is certainly nothing new, that this combination of art and science and art and research. I mean, it has been brought to the surface in the last 10 years, I mean, I don't know, maybe 10, 20 years or so, and this is largely to do with at least in Finland, like in the academia, there's things like artists have started to get degrees and doctorates and so on. So there's lots more talk about this combination of art and science or art and research. But of course, artists throughout the ages have done lots of research, and it's been an integral part of artistic work and combination of art and science. So yes, so you're absolutely right in a way that yes, this is not new and it's been done since all these other artists and scientists long time ago.
Yes, it
I mean,
has been.
I suspect that we all find influences from different artists and creators and scientists, especially from, when I mentioned I haven't thought about Brecht for a long time, I thought about Brecht a lot when I was studying in university, and we did a lot more, looking back historically at all kinds of artists and people creating works. I mean, those people have definitely influenced our approaches, and my approaches certainly in what I do, because, I think it's clear that there's a through line from what you read about and what you study to how you actually create. So for sure.
Yeah, definitely is.
Yeah, I think there are different figures, and I'm expert on none of them. But I think we think about Leonardo and this era, it's also like, maybe it's very hard to imagine that they didn't see the divide between art and science. They were studying something which now informs these divided practices, but Leonardo's work was both like undivided art and science, yeah? So that's, it's not probably, I don't think we can go back and trying to recreate that because we are in different times, but definitely it's something, for me it's very interesting to kind of imagine that this is not unchanging, what is art and what is science, that it both changes over the time. So.
Yes, and we were talking when we were talking in advance about this panel, we were talking that this is a trend. This art and science talk is a trend. So it's kind of a trend that has now somehow emerged. And when you have a trend, then it's always there is the possibility that nobody remembers that this was done 1,000 years ago already. But now we have a trend, so everybody wants to be on the high tide of the trend. So it's a very good question. And also, when you were doing your presentation, you were referring to these old stories, for example, from the Sami about the aurora, which is a kind of we are making these lines into the history all the time when we do research. Exactly how Mark also said. That when you research things, you most certainly research also something that has gone, something historical, something that somebody before us researched this thing and they said this and now I will say that. Okay. Any other comments, questions from the audience? Are we happy now? Did we get into some kind of a conclusion here?
Is there a conclusion?
Well, I'm happy. So thank you, Agata, Hanna, Minna, Mark. The audience will end here.